conflict over Iran's nuclear activities has further escalated today after the International Atomic Energy Association, that's the IAEA, said that it failed to secure an agreement with Iran during talks over disputed atomic activities. Iran also rejected the IAEA's request to visit a military site at Parchin, southeast of Tehran, believed to house a facility to test explosives. Now, the failure of talks heightens the chances of a confrontation between Iran and the West. I'm talking a military strike. Reuters reports that a defiant Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, said that Iran's nuclear policies would not change. State television quotes Khamenei as saying, "With God's help and without paying attention to propaganda, Iran's nuclear course should continue firmly and seriously. Pressure, sanctions and assassinations will bear no fruit. No obstacles can stop Iran's nuclear work." So are we heading towards a military strike over the next few months? Well, joining me to talk about that is Alistair Newton, Chief Political Analyst at Nomura. Alistair, thank you very much for your time. I'm just going over the key points that you made in your report dated February 10th, where you talk about the prospects for a military strike against Iran's nuclear program this year being influenced by the political cycle in both Israel and the US. Can you take us through the various political and election scenarios that you see playing out over the next few months that may or may not trigger a strike?
Certainly. The first thing to say is that I don't think that Premier Netanyahu in Israel will want to launch a military strike in the immediate run-up to an Israeli general election. Were things to go wrong with the operation, then it would probably be bad news for him electorally. Now, Israel doesn't have to have a general election until September, October of next year, but in January, Netanyahu called a snap Likud leadership primary, winning it quite convincingly, which effectively clears the way for an early election. Now, were Israel to have an early election, there would be a window between then and the US presidential election on the 6th of November, which may provide Netanyahu with what he would see as the best window of opportunity politically to launch a strike against Iran. The point here is that Netanyahu and American President Barack Obama don't get on particularly well, although I would expect to see them papering over the cracks in Netanyahu's visit to Washington scheduled for early next month. And the Americans are very, very keen that the Israelis not do this. Nevertheless, in a run-up to a US presidential election, it would be a very brave candidate indeed in the US who would condemn Israel or not support Israel for launching a military strike at what is widely perceived in the US, as indeed in Israel, as being a potential existential threat to the state of Israel. Now, there's a lot of ifs in that, and I would stress that right now I would only put about a 30% probability of this operation happening during the course of the next 12 months. But that's still higher than I would have said certainly last year and indeed in any previous year.
All right, you've put it at a 30% probability, but you've also said that events in Iran may precipitate an early strike. What are those events in your assessment that could in fact increase that probability ratio from 30% to higher?
Well, I think the key issue is if the Iranians were suddenly to accelerate nuclear-related activity at the new facility at Fordow, which is deemed by most experts, including Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak, to be more or less attack-proof as far as bombing is concerned. The Iranians have made noises to the effect that they are going to set up a major enrichment facility there. They did roll out these new generation centrifuges just a few days ago, although it remains to be seen how effective those are. Now, we do need to be clear, Iran has already crossed a great many declared red lines, declared by Israel as red lines, without Israel reacting by a military strike. So there's no guarantee that Fordow would prove to be a definitive red line. Furthermore, the Iranians can probably help to mitigate the risk of an attack by coming back to the negotiating table. And notwithstanding what you said in your introductory remarks quite correctly about the disappointment of the visit this week, there are clear signs that the Iranians may well be preparing to try to come back to the P5+1 format, which has been on ice for the last few months. And there are also clear signs that the Americans and indeed the Europeans would welcome that. So we may see a return to negotiations, but I have to say, based on their track record, that I am extremely sceptical about Iran using negotiations for any purpose other than to play for time.
Alistair, how do you see the oil embargo play into this situation, considering the kind of economic hardship that it would add to Iran's current problems? We're already seeing a hostile situation by Iran in response to Europe's sanctions, which kick in about 3 months' time, in July this year. How do you see that playing into this situation? Do you see that exacerbating the situation?
I certainly think it's going to exacerbate Iran's already non-negligible economic problems at home, but a great deal will be dependent on whether Iran can find alternative customers to buy the 600,000 barrels a day or so which the Europeans are going to embargo. Now, it's worth keeping in mind at this time that of Iran's major customers, China is in a dispute with Iran over payment terms and has already halved the amount of oil it's importing from Iran. Two of the other major customers, Japan and of course India, remains to be seen how they would react to the Iranians trying to offload more of their oil on them. I do wonder if India is going to be very cautious, especially given the recent alleged terrorism activity connected with Iran, which fortunately this time failed to cause any serious damage in India, which has already suffered enough from terrorism in recent years without a threat from Iran materializing as well.
All right, we've also heard that Japan and South Korea have committed to the West that they will reduce their offtake of Iranian oil. So that is a volatile situation. It is playing out in the oil markets in terms of pricing already. You mentioned India in this process, and I must ask very quickly, what do you think the kind of role India will play at all if this conflict escalates?
Well, I think India clearly finds itself in a delicate position. It rightly has a high regard for its neutrality in many of these issues. It does have close historical and contemporary relations with Iran and valuable trade and economic links with Iran. For all that, though, India is a hugely responsible member of the international community. It takes its international responsibilities very seriously, and I'm sure that any Indian government, including this one, will wish to think very, very carefully indeed about Iran's situation, and we all have to be very cautious about the consequences of a possible military strike against Iran. There would certainly be an oil spike. How long that would last would remain to be seen. It would depend very much on how the Iranians retaliated or reacted to an Israeli military strike. It would clearly not be a good thing for India's economy as a major energy importer. So let us hope that sensible counsel, wise counsel prevails, and that we can avoid actions which would precipitate or at least increase the risk of a strike. As you remarked in your question, we are already seeing upward pressure on oil, with Brent hovering around the 120 mark, considerably higher in my view than it should be relative to global economic fundamentals. And whilst Iran is not the sole cause of that, it is certainly the major cause today.
All right, I know you've put the eventuality, or you've put the probability of the strike at 30%, and I don't mean to get ahead of the situation or irresponsibly speculate, but I must ask you this. If there is a military strike against Iran, what will the consequences be? How do you expect Iran will respond, and really to what extent can this escalate into?
Well, my personal view is that actually Iran doesn't have any really good retaliation options. There are some things it could do. Maybe it could launch Hezbollah against Israel, although I don't see that as being bad news for oil markets. The fear which everybody has is that Iran would do something which would block the Strait of Hormuz, but any attempt to block the Strait of Hormuz by whatever means would undoubtedly, in my view, lead to military action by the Americans to keep the strait open. And the Americans have a minimum of 2 carrier groups and at times 3 carrier groups in the region, plus of course a lot of land station forces in various parts of the GCC. With all due respect to Iran and its military, I don't think it would be too keen to take on the might of the United States. Now, for all that, Iran actually doesn't have to do anything, in my view, to close the Strait of Hormuz if Israel does attack it, because I strongly suspect that, as happened at the start of the Iran-Iraq war in 1980, you will find that the marine insurance industry will lift insurance cover on any ship entering the strait until it is clear exactly how secure or insecure the situation is there. The good news, though, is that in that event, I expect the GCC to react very quickly, as they eventually did in 1980, to provide full sovereign cover against total loss. I would expect the Americans to instigate a convoy system if necessary, so we may see any consequent spike from an Israeli attack tail off quite quickly, but perhaps not to the sort of level which we had seen before the spike. Now, if we assume oil is somewhere close to the 110, 120 band at the time this could happen, which is where it's been for pretty much the last 12 months, I hate to think what we'll see oil go to initially, but we could quite quickly see it tail off again back to maybe 130. Still bad news for emerging markets, which are major energy importers, and therefore for the global economy, but perhaps not quite as bad as a lot of people fear.
So it seems to me from what you're saying that you don't think Brent at 120 fully reflects reflects the market's belief that there will be a strike at least over the next 3 to 6 months. At 120 does not reflect a high probability of a strike.
I think markets are hedging at the moment. As I suggested a few moments ago, we've got a number of factors playing in this. We've lost oil output from South Sudan, from Yemen. There is a dip in North Sea production at this time for technical reasons. I think there are legitimate political concerns over Venezuela in an election year when President Chavez's health is under some scrutiny, although I'm not sure how that could impact negatively on oil supply. And of course there's concerns around Nigeria and the unrest which we've seen in the north of the country there, although I would argue personally that that poses no direct threat to oil supply either. Syrian oil, of course, has been embargoed by the European Union. On the plus side, Libya is producing around 800,000 barrels a day, which is pretty impressive considering that it was producing 0 back in August. Also on the demand side, Japan is importing additional supplies of fuel oil with its nuclear reactor fleet gradually closing down. Only 3 power stations left working now, and those will be shut soon. That is likely to continue to put upward pressure on demand. So all of that is coming into play. We could probably add to that concerns about Iraq, where the security situation has deteriorated as well. And then, of course, on top of all of that, there is Iran. Now, 120 would look to me to be maybe 20-25% above a fair value based on economic fundamentals. I think it reflects political concern, but I also think that markets are not seeing this happening imminently. Now, for all that, it's worth keeping in mind that we are told by the press, off the record, the US Secretary of State for Defense, Leon Panetta, claimed recently that Israel could launch a strike as early as April to June when the weather conditions would be at their most favourable. I certainly wouldn't rule that out, but my personal inclination is to think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, a cautious politician by nature, may well prefer to wait until he sees which way the US presidential election may pan out. With a Republican in the White House in 2013, or the prospect of a Republican, I think he might stay his hand for now. With Barack Obama looking likely to be returned for a second term, he and Edward Barak may, as I suggested earlier, calculate that in political terms their best opportunity could be the autumn of this year.
All right, one final question, Alistair, and that has to do with the impact of the spectre of a military strike on other commodity markets besides oil and equity markets as well. We've had a good beginning to the year. There seems to be some degree of confidence returning to the European sovereign debt situation, but will this undo all of that?
I was interesting. I was actually in East and Southeast Asia last week, and there was much more concern among portfolio managers to whom I was talking about oil and the Iran related risks than there was about the Eurozone. Now, for all of that, I don't think we should be lulled into a false sense of security just yet over the Eurozone. There is a lot of reservations among credit markets at the moment here in Europe, and equity portfolio managers are not as bullish as the recent surge in stock markets might suggest. We are by no means out of the woods with Greece, despite the agreement which was struck earlier this week. There are uncertainties around Portugal's debt sustainability. We have French elections coming up, and the probability that once those elections are over, there will be some shakedown between France and Germany over the fiscal compact. So a long way to go in Europe as yet. The additional possibility of some sort of oil spike clearly adds to uncertainty and could be extremely disruptive to what looks like it may be a global economic recovery, but still with significant downside risks revolving around the Eurozone.
Alistair Newton, I appreciate the time you've taken to speak with us today and take us through the various scenarios.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure having you on the show, even though it is about a rather unpleasant topic. That's Alistair Newton, their Chief Political Analyst at Nomura. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this edition of Your World at 10. Thanks very much for watching.